A simple fisherman went out for his morning catch and suddenly noticed a strange silhouette in the fog. As he rowed closer, he realized it was a massive house drifting in the middle of the sea. But what he discovered inside changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. The morning began like countless others in the fisherman's life. His small village sat quietly on the shore of a wide, deep lake, a place where the water's temperament shifted with the seasons, but where life itself rarely seemed to change. He had lived here for as long as he could remember, and in many ways the lake was the rhythm of his existence. The wooden docks stretching into the water were weathered from generations of use. Nets hung drying between leaning posts, and the chimneys of modest homes exhaled thin trails of smoke into the damp air. Every day started with the same routine, and to him that sameness was both comfort and burden. He was a man of middle years, his body strong but shaped by long labor. His hands were calloused, his skin darkened by sun and wind, and his clothes bore the faded look of garments worn day after day. His boat, patched many times, floated low in the water, but still carried him faithfully into the gray vastness of the lake. This particular morning, however, the lake wore a face unlike any other. The fog had rolled in so thick, it was as though the world beyond the immediate reach of the oars had ceased to exist. The fisherman could hear the muffled sound of waves slapping softly against the wooden hull, and every stroke of his paddle was swallowed by the white curtain around him. It was unusually silent. Birds that usually greeted dawn with restless cries were absent. The stillness was not the calm of peace, but the heavy hush of anticipation, and though he was a man who seldom entertained thoughts of superstition, he could not shake the feeling that the fog was concealing more than just the opposite shore. He set his line in the water, watching the float disappear into the mist. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time was difficult to measure in such conditions. The world shrank to the gentle creak of the oarlocks and the smell of damp wood. His mind wandered, as it often did when he fished, toward memories of his youth, when he believed adventure could be found beyond the hills encircling the lake. Age had not robbed him of curiosity, but it had taught him patience. That patience was interrupted when, from the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a shadow moving in the fog. At first he dismissed it as imagination, yet the shape returned, darker this time, tall and oddly geometric. The longer he watched, the more certain he became that something immense loomed in the whiteness ahead. At first he guessed it might be a barge, some old vessel left adrift, though no barges had sailed here in decades. The lake was not a place for commerce. It belonged to fishermen, to families, to quiet evenings at the water's edge. He straightened in the boat, tightened his grip on the oar, and with cautious strokes propelled himself toward the apparition. His heart beat faster. The fog thinned for a moment, pulled apart by a breeze, and what emerged from behind the veil froze him in place. It was a house, not a shack or a cabin, but a vast wooden structure rising directly from the surface of the water, anchored in place as though it had stood there for centuries. Wide verandas wrapped around its bulk, tall windows stared blankly across the lake, and a sagging roof stretched above it all. The house seemed far too large, too heavy to float, and yet there it was, unmoving in the gentle swells. The fisherman blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, even turned away and back again, certain his vision was deceiving him. But the house did not fade. It loomed with undeniable reality, black against the gray fog. His first instinct was to flee, to row back toward the familiar safety of the village and pretend he had seen nothing. Fear prickled at his skin. This was not a natural sight. The lake was a place of water, reeds, and fish, not mansions set adrift like phantoms. He imagined telling the other men at the docks how they might laugh or cross themselves, dismiss him as a dreamer, or warn him not to speak further of such things. But beneath the fear, a stronger pull began to rise, a tug that had guided him many times in life. Curiosity. He had spent years believing he knew every cove, every hidden rock and channel of this lake, and now something beyond comprehension stood before him. To turn away would leave him haunted. He pushed the paddle back into the water and guided his boat closer. The fog curled around the enormous structure, peeling away to reveal more of its form. The paint had long since peeled from its siding, leaving streaks of gray wood that matched the mist. The windows were smudged and opaque, reflecting nothing. Along one side, jutting from the base, stretched a narrow pier of warped boards, just wide enough for a single man to walk. The pier groaned and dipped with each wave, yet somehow held steady. The fisherman's boat drifted nearer until the bow nudged gently against the pier's edge. He sat motionless, listening. Not a single sound came from within the house. Not the scrape of furniture, not the sigh of a door, not even the scurrying of small animals that might have taken refuge. He let his paddle rest, staring up at the facade. The structure was massive, far larger than any dwelling in his village, and its sheer presence pressed on him like the weight of a storm. Questions tumbled through his mind. Who had built such a place? How had it remained hidden? Why was it here, alone, floating on water where nothing like this had ever been seen? His thoughts churned faster than the waves beneath him. He shifted uneasily, gripping the side of the boat as though that touch of familiar wood could anchor him to reality. The air around him felt colder. The fog pressed tighter, muting the world, leaving only him and the house in their own silent universe. He sensed that he stood on the edge of something that would unravel the simple order of his life. Every instinct screamed for him to return home. Yet another voice whispered that this was a moment meant for him alone. A moment that once lost could never return. Slowly, with hands that trembled despite his effort to steady them, he reached for the pier and pulled himself onto its unsteady planks. They groaned under his weight but did not break. He rose, balancing carefully, the boat drifting behind him, untethered. For the first time in many years, he felt as though he had crossed into another world. Ahead stood the towering frame of the house, its front door set in heavy shadow, waiting. The fisherman drew a deep breath, filling his lungs with air that tasted of damp wood and secrecy. He took his first step toward the door. Though he did not know it yet, the moment his foot touched the boards of that pier, his life as he had always known it was over. The ordinary rhythms of dawn, nets, and catch had ended. What awaited him within those walls would change everything. And the lake, which had once been his companion in simplicity, had become the threshold to a mystery deeper than its waters. And so, with the fog curling like a living thing around his shoulders, he walked forward, his pulse loud in his ears, toward the silent, floating house that had waited for him in the mist. The fisherman paused at the door, uncertain if his trembling hand would obey his mind's command. The fog had followed him onto the pier, swirling in faint tendrils along the planks, creeping as though reluctant to let him go. Behind him, the small boat rocked gently against the wood, and he understood with a pang that he had left behind the last familiar thing in his world. He placed his hand on the iron handle. It was colder than the air, biting against his palm. The door resisted at first as though swollen with moisture, then creaked open with a long groan that echoed across the empty water. He stepped inside and the door swung shut behind him with a dull thud that sounded disturbingly final. The hallway stretched before him, a long corridor lined with dark wood panels. Dust motes swirled in the thin shafts of light filtering through grimy windows. But even through the haze, he could see that the interior was no ruin. The walls stood straight, the beams unbroken, the staircases solid. The air smelled faintly of dampness and age, yet not of decay. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in and then abandoned only recently. He placed a hand against the wall and felt the firmness of well-crafted timber. Whoever had built this house had done so with skill, and whoever had cared for it had not let it rot. He advanced slowly, each step releasing a low creak from the floorboards. His eyes moved from one detail to another, and with each glance his confusion deepened. Heavy curtains framed the tall windows, their fabric faded but not tattered. Along the walls hung portraits in gilt frames, stern-faced men and women staring out with expressions of silent judgment. A tall clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at a time he did not bother to read, yet its glass face was free of dust, as though it had been wiped recently. His heart pounded as he realized that this place was not the lifeless ruin it first appeared to be. It was asleep, perhaps, but not dead. Turning into a side room, he found himself in a library that spanned from floor to ceiling. Shelves groaned beneath the weight of books whose spines bore strange titles. Many volumes seemed ancient, bound in cracked leather with lettering in languages he did not recognize. He pulled one from the shelf and a puff of dust escaped. making him cough. The pages were filled with charts, symbols, and equations that meant nothing to him. Another book, more recent, had notes scribbled in the margins, drawings of stars, diagrams of the lake, lines of text underlined so often the paper was nearly torn through. The handwriting was precise, obsessive. Someone had spent years collecting knowledge here. A study opened off the library and he stepped inside. The air here was cooler, the curtains half drawn, the room dominated by a wide desk that overlooked the lake through tall windows. On the desk lay maps spread out beneath glass, their surfaces scarred with ink marks. Circles had been drawn around points on the water, arrows traced from one shore to another. Symbols like compasses or ancient runes were scrawled in margins. Notes were written in the same obsessive hand, dated carefully over the years, and the most recent entry bore a date that could not possibly be more than a few months old. His stomach tightened. This house was not only occupied within memory, it had been tended almost yesterday. Leaning against the wall near the desk was a long telescope, its brass gleaming faintly even in the dim light. The fisherman moved to it, touching its cool metal surface, and aimed it out the window. The fog was still heavy, and the shore was invisible, but he imagined the countless nights when someone had stood exactly where he now stood, watching the horizon, searching for signs in the stars or in the water's shifting patterns. He shivered. The thought that eyes had been fixed on this lake with such relentless attention unsettled him more than if the place had been truly abandoned. He left the study, moving deeper into the mansion, and entered a wide dining hall. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, its surface layered with dust except for one place at the far end where a chair had been pulled out. The wood of the chair was worn smooth from use, and the place before it was cleaner than the rest, as though someone had sat here recently, perhaps every night, eating alone in the silence of this floating palace. He imagined the sound of utensils scraping against a plate, the faint clink of glass, the lonely rhythm of meals taken without company. His mouth went dry. The thought of unseen inhabitants lurking just beyond his sight pressed heavy on his chest. The bedrooms upstairs told another story. The first was bare but neat, the bed made with sheets that were surprisingly white. He touched them and realized they had been washed not long ago. Another room contained a bed draped with a heavy quilt, dust thick on its folds, untouched for years. And still another room had walls lined with clocks. Dozens of them, each stopped at a different hour, their pendulums frozen mid-swing, their hands pointing to moments lost. He lingered there, staring, listening for a tick that never came. It was as though time itself had been captured in silence within these walls. A dressing table in that room bore a small locket, tarnished by years but still intact. He picked it up, opened it, and froze. Inside was the photograph of a baby, its face blurred by the small frame, but unmistakably human, innocent. Beneath the picture was a single word engraved on the inner surface, Roe. The letters cut deep into the metal made his skin prickle. He closed the locket quickly and placed it back, his mind racing. That name meant nothing to him personally, but the sense that it connected him to something beyond his understanding was undeniable. By the time he descended back into the main hall, the fisherman's head swirled with questions. Who had lived here? Who still lived here? Why had this place appeared only today, on this morning of heavy fog? And why did it feel, with every step he took, that the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to discover something more? The air inside was cooler now, though the day outside had grown warmer. Shadows deepened in the corners, and the silence of the house pressed harder on his ears. He returned to the front hall, meaning to step outside and breathe in the open air again. But when he touched the door, the wood resisted as if it had swollen shut. It did not move. He stepped back, chest tight, listening again for any sound from the upper floors, from the walls, from the vast lake pressing against the foundation. Nothing but silence greeted him. He realized then that leaving would not be so simple. The house had opened itself to him, revealed its secrets in whispers and fragments, and now it seemed to demand he continue deeper. He remembered the clean chair at the table, the fresh sheets, the notes dated only weeks before. Whoever had lived here, or still lived here, had wanted him to find it, and the thought that he had stumbled into something prepared for him filled him with a terror greater than any fog could conceal. He stood in the hallway, the dim light casting long shadows around him, and breathed in the stale air. He knew instinctively that night would soon fall, and that he would not reach his village before darkness covered the lake. The decision formed itself without his conscious thought. He would remain here until morning. He would see what the house wished to show him, and only then would he know whether he could leave. The fisherman returned to the library, choosing a chair near the shelves, and lowered himself onto it. His body was weary, yet his mind raced. He thought of the locket with the name Roe, of the frozen clocks, of the obsessive maps and calculations. He tried to piece them together, but the fragments made no sense. A cold weight pressed on his heart as the shadows lengthened, and the house grew darker around him. Soon he would need a candle, perhaps one from the dining hall or a lantern from the study. He would need light, for the mansion seemed to breathe with unseen presence in the gloom. Outside, the lake lapped gently at the foundation. Inside, he waited, every nerve alert, certain that as night settled, the mansion would not let him rest in peace. What he had found so far was only the surface. The deeper truths lay hidden, waiting for him to stumble upon them. And so the fisherman, who had left his village that morning expecting nothing more than a day of ordinary fishing, sat in the library of a floating mansion, prepared against his own will to spend the night. Somewhere in the darkness above or below him, secrets stirred, patient and silent, biding their time. The first exploration had ended, but the true ordeal was only about to begin. The fisherman remained seated in the library long after the light outside had dimmed to a gray wash, his body stiff and weary from the day, but his mind unwilling to surrender to rest. The shelves loomed above him, packed with books whose spines whispered of subjects far beyond his grasp. Their silent presence pressed against him like the weight of 100 unspoken voices. Every tick of time seemed slower within the walls of the floating mansion, though he knew the clocks in the upstairs chamber had long since fallen silent. The decision he had made to remain until morning sat in his stomach like a stone. He had no candle lit yet, only the pale glow of fading daylight filtering through the thick glass panes, and as it thinned into darkness, he found himself staring into the shifting gloom, waiting for the house to make its next move. When the first sound came, it was almost gentle, a creak from above that might have been nothing more than the natural settling of wood. But it repeated, deliberate and measured, the sound of a footfall across old planks. His hand tightened on the arm of the chair. He told himself it was impossible, that he was alone, but the rhythm of the steps betrayed intent. Someone, or something, was walking in the rooms above. He rose quietly, heart pounding, and strained his ears. The steps moved, paused, then resumed, as though pacing. He thought of the fresh sheets he had seen on one of the beds upstairs, and felt his breath catch. The house was not as empty as it appeared. He took a lantern from the study, fumbling for a match, and struck it with trembling fingers. The wick caught, casting a weak but steady glow that pushed back the shadows. The flame flickered with each draft that whispered through unseen cracks, stretching the shadows into long, reaching fingers. Lantern in hand, he crept into the hall and tilted his head upward, staring at the ceiling where the footsteps had sounded. Now there was only silence. His heart thudded louder than the quiet. Slowly, he began to ascend the stairs, each step groaning beneath his weight. At the top, he paused, holding the lantern aloft, letting its light sweep across the hallway lined with closed doors. He half expected one of them to open at that very moment. None did. Gathering courage, he opened the first door. The room beyond was dark, its bed neatly made, untouched since his earlier inspection. He closed it quickly, moved to the next, and found it also empty. The third door, however, revealed something that made the skin on his arms rise. The kerosene lamp on the dresser was glowing faintly, its flame low but steady, though he had never touched it. The air smelled faintly of oil and smoke, proof that it had been lit by someone. He stepped inside slowly, holding the lantern before him, searching for any movement in the shadows. There was nothing, no figure, no presence, but the certainty that another hand had lit that lamp gnawed at him. He extinguished the flame and left the room, pulling the door shut behind him. As he did, the sound of something soft echoed through the hallway, A sigh, or perhaps the brush of fabric against wood. He spun, lantern raised, but saw nothing. His throat was dry, his pulse hammering against his temples. He whispered to himself, though the sound brought no comfort, that he would endure the night. That morning would bring clarity. Yet even as he said it, he doubted. The house seemed intent on testing his resolve, stripping him of the certainty that he was alone. Back downstairs, he wandered into the dining hall. The long table stretched into darkness, and his lantern's glow revealed only a sliver of its length. He moved slowly toward the far end, where the single chair had been drawn out, the one that had looked used. There upon the tabletop sat something that had not been there before, a folded newspaper. His hand trembled as he reached for it, the paper crinkling softly. When he lifted it into the light, he saw the date clearly printed on the top of the front page. It was today, not last week, not a month ago, but this very day. His head swam. He had rowed out onto the lake that morning. He had found this place when it should not have existed. Yet the paper was here, fresh and crisp, carrying stories from a world that seemed impossibly far away. The implications tore at him. Someone had been here recently, perhaps hours ago. Perhaps they were here still, watching him from behind a hidden panel, waiting for him to find the next clue. His grip on the lantern tightened until his knuckles whitened. He laid the newspaper down carefully and stepped away, refusing to let the panic overtake him. He would not flee, not yet. Drawn by hunger and the desire to busy his hands, he made his way to the kitchen. The pantry door creaked as he opened it, revealing shelves stocked with canned goods, jars, and even loaves of bread. Some of the food was old, dust-covered, but others looked fresh. He lifted a jar of preserved fruit and saw no mold, no sign of decay. Whoever lived here, or had lived here, had kept these supplies replenished. The thought chilled him more than it reassured. He took a can, opened it with difficulty, and ate in silence at the wooden counter, the taste of the food dull in his mouth. Afterward, he returned to the library and sat once more, lantern beside him, determined to wait out the night. But sleep did not come easily. Each time his eyelids lowered, some noise jolted him awake. A door hinge groaning faintly, the whisper of the wind against the glass, the faint scrape of wood as though a chair had been pulled across the floor in another room. Hours stretched impossibly long. The darkness pressed in, heavy and suffocating. When at last exhaustion overcame him, he slumped back in the chair and closed his eyes. He did not know how long he drifted before sound tore him awake. A low thump, like metal striking metal, somewhere below the floorboards. His eyes flew open, breath catching in his throat. The sound came again, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. The air had turned cold, a damp chill seeping into his bones. He rose unsteadily, gripping the lantern, and stepped into the hallway. His legs felt heavy as though the house itself resisted his movement. But he pressed on, drawn by a mix of dread and curiosity. The footsteps he had heard before were absent now, replaced by the faint rush of air, a current that seemed to beckon him forward. He passed the study, the dining hall, following the sound toward the rear of the mansion where he had not ventured before. The lantern's light skimmed across the walls until it fell upon something he had not noticed earlier. A heavy tapestry hanging from ceiling to floor, its fabric dark with age. Behind it he could feel a draft. His fingers, numb from cold, clutched the edge and pulled it aside. There, revealed in the dim glow, was a door of iron set into the wall, its handle icy to the touch. The fisherman's breath caught in his chest. He had not imagined the noise. The house had led him here. With effort he twisted the handle, the hinges protesting as the door swung open to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The air that rose from below was thick, salted, tinged with something ancient. He hesitated only a moment, then lifted the lantern high and began his descent. The steps groaned beneath him as he moved downward, deeper and deeper into the belly of the floating house. Each turn of the spiral seemed to close him off from the world above, until the silence of the lake was nothing but a memory. The cold intensified, pressing into his skin. The lantern flames sputtered in the drafts that rose from below, but he shielded it with his hand and pressed onward, driven by the need to uncover the source of the strange sounds and the impossible freshness of the house. At the bottom, he found himself standing in a corridor that stretched farther than seemed possible within the confines of the mansion. Its walls were lined with drawers, each labeled in a careful hand: genealogy, correspondence, expeditions. He walked slowly past them, the light glinting off metal handles, his breath clouding in the chill air. One drawer near the middle bore a single word that froze him where he stood: Roe, the same name he had seen engraved inside the locket upstairs. His hand shook as he pulled it open. Inside lay letters, unsent, their envelopes addressed to his father. The fisherman stared in disbelief, the names and places written in ink so clear, so deliberate, that the connection was undeniable. Someone in this house had reached for his family and been ignored. The letters trembled in his hand as the realization seeped into him. This house was not a chance discovery. It was tied to him, to his blood, to his forgotten past. His heart thundered in his chest as he set the letters back into the drawer, unable to process their full meaning. Ahead, at the far end of the corridor, loomed a massive vault door, its surface cold and gleaming in the lantern light. Across it were painted words that sent a fresh shiver down his spine. Authorized eyes only, Jonas Archive. He stepped closer, each footfall echoing in the hollow space, and placed his hand on the heavy wheel at its center. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the corridor as he turned it, straining with all his strength. The wheel gave at last with a reluctant groan, and a faint click signaled the release of the lock. The fisherman drew a deep breath, lantern trembling in his grasp, and pulled the door open. What lay beyond was sealed still, another door without a handle, but beside it a hand-shaped panel glowed faintly, waiting. A note taped above it caught his eye. The words were written in the same precise hand he had seen on the maps and in the margins of books. They read, "For him alone, for the blood that binds, for Elliot Roe." The fisherman's throat tightened. His name was not Elliot, and yet the name Roe echoed like a bell struck deep within his chest. The air around him seemed to thrum with unseen energy, as though the mansion itself recognized him, claimed him. He stood frozen in the underground corridor, letters of his family still burning in his mind. The words on the note a summons he could not yet comprehend. The night had brought him here, step by reluctant step, from whispers and footsteps to hidden rooms and forbidden archives. And as he stood before the vault door, lantern light flickering across the words that tied him irrevocably to this place, he understood that his journey had only begun. The house had chosen him. It would not let him go until he unearthed every secret it guarded, no matter how much the truth might shatter the life he thought he knew. He lingered before the vault door with the trembling flame of his lantern casting erratic shadows against the cold metal. The words written on the note above the hand-shaped scanner burned into his mind like a brand. For him alone, for the blood that binds, for Elliot Roe. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as he fought the rising storm of thoughts that crashed through him. He was not Elliot, yet the name Roe had already haunted him twice within the walls of this mansion, once engraved in the locket, and now here, etched in an unmistakable declaration. Coincidence seemed impossible. The mansion knew more about him, about his past, than he knew of himself, and with that realization came a bone-deep chill that no lantern flame could drive away. He reached out tentatively and pressed his rough hand against the panel. For a long moment nothing happened, and then a low hum filled the air, the sound of some hidden mechanism stirring to life. The panel glowed brighter, tracing the outline of his hand with pale light, and then flickered dark again. Somewhere behind the sealed door, a lock released, groaning like an old creature waking from slumber. The fisherman drew in a sharp breath, bracing himself, and then pushed. The door moved with effort, scraping open to reveal a chamber beyond that stretched wider than the corridor behind him. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, smelling faintly of salt and iron. His lantern revealed rows of shelves laden with artifacts, rusted tools, jars filled with strange preserved specimens, rolled maps, and countless books stacked in precarious towers. It was not the cellar of a home, but the archive of an obsession. He moved cautiously between the shelves, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and ran his eyes over the labels attached to objects. Some bore familiar words: weather patterns, lake currents, celestial charts. Others were marked with symbols and codes that meant nothing to him. It was as though someone had spent a lifetime cataloging the secrets of the world, all hidden here beneath the floating mansion. At the far end of the chamber stood a long desk covered in papers. He set the lantern down and began to sift through them. Pages of careful handwriting described storms with terrifying precision, predictions of seasonal floods, calculations of wind speeds and rainfall that spanned decades. In the margins were frantic notes, underlined words, exclamations scrawled in a darker hand as if written in moments of feverish urgency. The more he read, the clearer the pattern became. Whoever had written these had devoted their life to studying catastrophe, preparing for a disaster that might one day consume everything. The house itself was part of that preparation, a fortress afloat, designed to endure whatever nature unleashed. His hand brushed against a small leather-bound notebook at the edge of the desk. He opened it and found to his shock not equations or weather logs, but personal entries. The handwriting was the same, but the words bore a different weight. They spoke of family, of loss, of regret. And then he found a name written again and again, always underlined as though to emphasize its importance. Roe. He read on, his eyes darting across the page, and learned of a woman long ago, someone dear to the writer who had died young, leaving behind a child. The entries grew more desperate, filled with sorrow and guilt. The writer had withdrawn from the world, pouring all his grief into the construction of the house and into the meticulous study of nature's fury. The fisherman set the notebook down, his hands trembling. The realization seeped into him slowly, as though his mind resisted it. The woman described sounded familiar, not by memory but by resemblance to the stories his mother had once told him of relatives he had never met. And the child mentioned in the notebook, could it have been someone in his own family? His throat tightened. He had come here believing he was nothing more than an intruder, stumbling upon a relic of strangers. But the more he discovered, the more undeniable the connection became. This was no accident. He had been brought here by threads of blood he had never known bound him. He turned from the desk and searched deeper into the cellar. At the back of the chamber he discovered a smaller room sealed by a wooden door. It gave way easily, revealing a laboratory of sorts. Instruments lay scattered across tables, glass tubes clouded with residue, brass instruments measuring pressure and wind, a telescope mounted to a stand aimed toward a small porthole window that looked out into the dark water beyond. He approached the telescope, peered through it, and saw only the murky depths of the lake. But he could imagine nights when its lens had been turned toward the heavens, charting stars and tracing the movements of storms across the sky. On another table rested a series of photographs, black and white prints curling at the edges. He lifted one and felt his stomach clench. It showed a woman standing on the shore of the very lake he had fished all his life. Her features were clear, despite the grainy quality of the image. And though he could not place her exactly, she bore a resemblance to his mother in her youth. He shuffled through more photographs, each one pulling him deeper into the past. Some showed the woman with a man whose face was stern, intense, the kind of face that belonged to someone consumed by their purpose. Others showed the house itself in earlier days, newly built, standing proud on the water like a monument. At last he found a photograph that made his breath stop. It was of a baby, no older than a few months, wrapped in a blanket, its eyes wide open. Written beneath in neat letters was the name Roe. His hands shook as he set the photograph down. It was the same name engraved on the locket, the same name in the notebook, the same name on the drawer in the corridor. This was not coincidence. This was his bloodline laid bare before him, a truth his family had either forgotten or hidden. He sank onto a nearby stool, lantern light trembling across the walls, and pressed his hands to his face. The cellar seemed to pulse with the weight of generations, the air thick with secrets that had waited patiently for him to uncover them. He thought of his quiet village, of the mornings spent on the lake with nothing but his boat and his nets. How small that life felt now, dwarfed by the revelation that he was the heir to something far greater and darker. He had not chosen this connection, yet it had chosen him. Time passed unmeasured as he sat in the cellar, trying to gather the strength to rise. When at last he stood, he felt as though the house itself was urging him onward, guiding him deeper into its embrace. He knew there was still more to uncover, more layers of truth waiting beneath the dust and shadows. But already the outlines of the story had begun to form. A man, perhaps his ancestor, had built this house not for luxury, but for survival, born of grief and obsession. That grief was tied to his own blood, his own family. The floating mansion was not a stranger's refuge. It was part of him, whether he accepted it or not. The lantern flickered low, warning him that its oil was nearly spent. He gathered what papers he could carry, folding them carefully into his jacket, and left the laboratory. As he retraced his steps through the cellar, past the vault door and back to the staircase, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Fear had not left him, but it had shifted, mingled now with purpose. He understood that his presence here was no accident of fishing in the fog. He had been summoned, whether by fate, blood, or some will woven into the walls of the house. Climbing the spiral staircase, the sound of his boots echoing in the stone, he emerged once more into the grand hall above. The mansion was silent, patient, as though waiting to see what he would do next. He set the lantern on a table and looked around at the portraits, the curtains, the endless shadows. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. He was no longer a stranger trespassing. He was a descendant come home, though the home itself was strange and terrible. Night pressed heavily outside, the lake invisible beyond the dark windows. He knew he could not leave now. He had to see this through. Somewhere in the depths of this house, perhaps even within its living memory, lay the full truth of who he was and why this place had waited for him. And though the thought of that truth filled him with dread, he knew he would not turn back. The cellar had revealed much, but it was only the beginning. What lay ahead would demand more of him than he had ever given. He squared his shoulders, inhaled the stale air of the mansion, and prepared himself. For he was certain that the house had more to say, and the voice of his bloodline was only beginning to speak. The night deepened around the mansion, though inside time seemed to flow differently, measured not by hours but by the rise and fall of his heartbeat as he absorbed the revelations unearthed in the cellar. He stood in the grand hall again, staring at the portraits that lined the walls. Their eyes seemed sharper now, as though knowing he had stepped closer to the truth. The papers he had carried up from below weighed heavy in his pocket, their words echoing in his mind. A house built for survival, a family torn by grief, a child whose name had been repeated like a prayer. The threads of blood tied him to this place, and he could no longer dismiss it as coincidence or imagination. He walked slowly to the great dining room, where the long table stretched into shadow. The chair at the end remained pulled out, waiting as it had before, but now its meaning seemed clearer. It was not the seat of a stranger, it was a place set aside, perhaps for him. He imagined the man who had built this house, sitting alone night after night, studying storms and recording notes while meals grew cold. He imagined that man whispering to the empty air, promising that one day his heir would arrive, would sit at that chair, would take up the burden of the legacy. The fisherman clenched his fists. He had not asked for such a burden, yet the weight of it settled on him all the same. His thoughts turned to his village, to the small home he had built with his own hands, to mornings filled with the simple rhythm of casting nets and returning with enough to live. It was a life of modest comfort, unremarkable but his own. And yet, even as he thought of it, it seemed to grow smaller, more fragile, a life dwarfed by the storm of revelations around him. He had always believed himself a man of no consequence, a shadow on the shore of the great lake. But the house told another story, one in which his bloodline was marked by obsession, by foresight, by secrets that had shaped generations. The air outside shifted, and he heard the low rush of waves striking harder against the foundation. The house creaked with the motion, as though stirred by the rising unrest of the water. He went to a window and pulled the heavy curtain aside. Beyond the glass he saw the lake churning, ripples building into restless swells. A cold wind pressed against the panes, making them rattle in their frames. It was as though the lake itself was alive, responding to his discovery, demanding that he choose his path before dawn. He thought again of the letters he had found in the drawer, addressed to his father, never answered. What silence had hidden them? Why had no one in his family spoken of this place, of the man who had built it, of the grief that had shaped it? Perhaps his parents had wished to protect him, to keep him bound to the safety of the ordinary world. Perhaps they had hoped the mansion would never reappear. But here it was, and here he stood, with the knowledge they had tried to bury. The truth was no longer avoidable. The fisherman moved through the mansion, restless. Each room seemed to echo with the weight of his choice. In the library, the books whispered of storms yet to come, their margins filled with warnings. In the study, the telescope remained fixed toward the lake, as though watching the water even in absence of the man who once used it. In the bedroom of clocks, the frozen hands pointed to a dozen different moments, reminding him that time itself could fracture, that destinies could be paused or abandoned. Every corner pressed the same question upon him. Would he turn away and return to the life he had known, or would he accept the inheritance that had been waiting for him all along? He went back to the cellar steps, lantern in hand, but did not descend. He only stood there, staring into the darkness below, listening to the faint hum that seemed to pulse in the stones. It was the heartbeat of the house, steady and patient, waiting for his decision. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. If he walked away now, if he took his boat and returned to the village at first light, the house might fade again into fog, might vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. Perhaps he could live out the rest of his days pretending it had been a dream. Yet he knew himself well enough to understand that he would never escape it. Every ripple on the lake, every shift of the wind, would remind him of the truth hidden just beyond his reach. His hand gripped the railing tightly. He could not unlearn what he knew. He could not erase the faces in the photographs, the letters addressed to his father, the name Rowe engraved in metal and ink alike. He was part of this, whether he accepted it or not. His only choice was whether to step forward into the role the house demanded of him, or to run and spend the rest of his life haunted by the knowledge that he had denied his blood. The lake roared louder, waves slapping the wooden dock outside. He imagined his small boat straining against the storm, the peril of venturing into such waters at night. It was as though the world itself conspired to hold him here until he chose. He turned from the cellar and walked back to the great hall, where he lowered himself onto a bench and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, tears came, hot and unbidden. They were not tears of fear alone, but of grief for the simplicity he was losing, for the life that had already slipped away the moment he had set foot on the pier. Yet when the tears slowed, he lifted his head with a strange calm. He looked around at the vast mansion, at the silence that enveloped it, and realized that he was not truly alone. The man who had built this place, the ancestor who had filled its rooms with knowledge and sorrow, still lingered here in every board and beam. The blood that bound them was undeniable. And though the thought of bearing that legacy terrified him, it also gave him strength. He was not merely a fisherman anymore. He was the heir to something larger, something that demanded courage. The first hint of dawn lightened the sky beyond the windows, turning the storm clouds a bruised purple. The house groaned as the waves subsided slightly, as if satisfied with his choice. He rose from the bench, his body weary but his resolve firm. He would not flee. He would not pretend the mansion had never appeared. Whatever lay ahead, whether burden or blessing, he would accept it. He walked to the study once more, placing his hands on the map spread across the desk. The inked lines and circles blurred before his tired eyes, but he understood their meaning now in a way he had not before. They were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the inheritance of a bloodline that had seen farther, that had prepared for storms when others turned away. He felt a surge of respect, even of kinship, for the man who had drawn them. And he knew that he would continue the work, not as a prisoner of obsession, but as a guardian of what had been entrusted to him. Outside, the lake began to calm. The fog thinned, revealing faint outlines of the distant shore. Soon the village would stir to life, unaware that within the heart of the lake, a fisherman had chosen a new destiny. He placed the lantern on the desk, straightened his back, and let out a long breath. The night had forced him to confront the truth of his blood. The dawn would demand he act upon it. And so as the first rays of light broke through the storm clouds and touched the surface of the water, He stood within the floating mansion, no longer merely its discoverer, but its heir. His choice had been made. The house was his now, and with it came the weight of all that had been hidden. He did not know what challenges awaited, but he knew he would face them. For he was Roe, and the mansion had always known it, long before he did. The dawn came slow and pale, the mist dragging itself reluctantly from the surface of the lake, as if unwilling to surrender the secrets it had cloaked through the night. Inside the mansion, the fisherman stood motionless at one of the tall windows, watching as the world beyond returned by degrees. The outlines of the distant shore grew sharper, the roofs of his village emerging from behind the veil of fog, familiar and small against the endless water. For a long time he did not move, for he knew that what he saw was not the same life he had left behind the day before. Though the houses and the docks and the hills were unchanged, he himself was not. The discovery of his blood, the weight of the inheritance, had altered him forever. He wandered through the mansion in the quiet hours of morning, each room still heavy with the shadows of the night. The library smelled of old paper and dust, the study of ink and brass, the dining hall of cold silence. Every detail seemed sharper now, every portrait more watchful, every object more charged with meaning. He felt the eyes of his ancestor on him from every corner, and rather than recoil from it, he allowed the gaze to strengthen him. The house had tested him, and though he had faltered, he had not turned away. Now it stood in the calm light of morning, like a companion that had revealed its heart at last. He knew he could not keep this place hidden from the world forever. Already the thought of returning to the village with nothing but silence pressed upon him like a lie too heavy to carry. The men at the docks, the women at the market, the children playing by the water, they all would eventually hear whispers of the house in the fog, and curiosity would drive them to seek answers. To keep the mansion's secret was to trap himself within it, a prisoner of its walls and of his own blood. To share it was to risk ridicule, fear, perhaps anger, but it was also to honor the legacy he had discovered. The decision weighed on him as the morning stretched on, until finally he took the only path his heart could allow. He would bring others here. He would show them what had been hidden, and in doing so, free the house from the burden of solitude. When at last he returned to the village, the day was well begun, the fishermen already preparing their nets, the smoke rising steadily from the chimneys. They looked at him with surprise, for he had not returned the night before, and questions immediately pressed from their lips. Where had he been? What had he found? Why did he look so changed? He did not answer them in haste. He gathered those who would listen and told them of the house, of its size, of its silence, of the discoveries he had made within. At first there was laughter, disbelief, and muttered words about fog and dreams. But as he spoke on, the conviction in his voice grew, and slowly so too did their unease. He was not a man given to tales. If he said the mansion was there, then surely it was. It was only after much persuasion and pleading that a few of the braver men agreed to follow him back to the lake's heart. Together they rowed out across the calm surface, the fog lifting higher into the morning sun, and when the shape of the house rose against the horizon, their mouths fell silent. No one laughed then. The mansion towered above them, immense and undeniable, its reflection shivering across the water. They tied their boats to the pier and followed the fishermen inside, their eyes wide as they beheld the library, the clocks, the portraits. What had been the burden of one man's blood now became a revelation for many. At first the villagers recoiled from the house, their fear of its uncanny presence too strong. Yet curiosity grew, and little by little they began to return. Some came to explore the rooms, others to help repair the cracked beams or clear the dust. Children chased each other through the long halls, their laughter echoing against the walls where silence had lived for decades. The fishermen watched it all with quiet wonder. The house that had once seemed cursed, a tomb of secrets and obsessions, was now alive with voices, with footsteps, with light. Still, even as it transformed, its strangeness never entirely faded. The fog clung closer around it than anywhere else on the lake, and there were days when the mansion seemed to vanish entirely, only to reappear with the shifting of the wind. Some swore that rooms changed position, that corridors lengthened or shortened, that doors opened onto places unseen before. The fisherman knew these things to be true, for he had felt them himself. But instead of fearing the mysteries, he embraced them. The house was not meant to be ordinary. It was meant to stand apart, a reminder that not all of life's truths could be explained or controlled. He dedicated himself to restoring it, not as a private dwelling, but as a place of learning and remembrance. The books in the library were cataloged and read, their knowledge shared among those who hungered for it. The maps and journals were studied, teaching lessons about weather, about survival, about the tenacity of those who came before. Slowly, the mansion became not a ghost upon the water, but a beacon. Travelers from other towns heard of it and came to see, bringing stories and leaving with others. What had once been shunned as a cursed place became a source of pride, a monument to endurance and mystery alike. Yet for all its new life, the fisherman never forgot what it had revealed to him in solitude. On quiet nights when the villagers had gone and the mansion stood still again, he would sit at the desk in the study, the telescope beside him, and run his hands across the maps. He would think of the ancestor who had built it in grief and hope, of the photographs and letters that had tied his blood to this place. He would think of the storms his ancestor had feared, of the calamities he had prepared for, and wonder if those storms were yet to come. In those moments, the house seemed to breathe again, as though whispering its secrets only to him, reminding him that while he had opened it to the world, it was still his by right of blood. He accepted that some mysteries would remain unsolved. The vanished footsteps in the night, the lamp that had lit itself, the clocks that froze at different hours, these he could not explain, but he no longer sought explanation. The mansion did not require it. It only required acknowledgement, respect, and the willingness to let it be what it was. He had chosen not to flee, and that choice had bound him to its fate as surely as his blood had. Years later, the house stood stronger than ever, its timbers repaired, its halls vibrant with life. Children who had once played there grew into adults who spoke of it with reverence, as though it were an elder in their midst. The fisherman aged too, his hands more gnarled, his steps slower, but his eyes carried the same quiet determination. He knew that when his time ended, the house would endure. It had waited for him, it would wait again, and perhaps someday another would feel the same pull of blood and be summoned across the fog. On one still evening, as the sun set in fire over the lake and the waters reflected the mansion's vast frame, the fisherman sat at the end of the long table in the dining hall. The chair was his now, not as a burden, but as a place of belonging. He listened to the faint sounds of laughter outside, the lapping of waves, the whisper of wind against the windows. And he felt peace. He no longer questioned why the house had chosen him. Some stories begin only after others end, and his was now woven into the timbers of this place. The mansion belonged not to a ghost, but to him, to his people, and to the blood that would follow. The house of fate had found its heir, and in the calm after storm, it had given him not just secrets, but a purpose. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply of the lake-scented air, and let the silence settle around him like a blessing. The story was not finished, nor would it ever be. It would live on in the fog, in the waves, in the walls of the floating mansion that had waited so long for its keeper. And for the first time in his life, he understood that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click right here to watch the next video that will leave you speechless, or dive into our other jaw-dropping stories waiting for you on the channel. And if this video shocked you, share it with your friends. Let them uncover the mystery too.